This video contains a fictional story created exclusively for entertainment and inspiration. This content is not intended for educational purposes. The narrative is original and was developed by a human creator with the support of artificial intelligence tools and creative review. No real events or historical facts are being presented as true. The morning arrived the way English mornings in late October so often do, not with a dramatic declaration, but with a slow, reluctant surrender of darkness to grey. The sky above Dunsmore Park held no warmth in it, just a flat pewter light that pressed down over the rolling hills of Wiltshire like the lid of a pot left on too long. Frost had touched the grass sometime in the small hours, and it still clung to the blades along the eastern lawn, where the sun had not yet reached, making the whole estate look as though it had been dusted in fine salt overnight. The old beeches along the North Drive stood in their October nakedness, their last remaining leaves the colour of dried blood and rust, the kind of colour that is beautiful precisely because it will not last. Tiberius Dunsmore stood at the window of his study on the first floor, one hand braced against the cold glass, the other wrapped around a porcelain cup that had long since gone tepid. He was not drinking it. He was staring at nothing, or rather, at the kind of nothing that is actually everything. The particular blankness a man's eyes take on when his mind is working at full speed behind them, and his body has simply agreed to remain still and wait it out. He was 34 years old, and he carried those years the way old houses carry their history, with a certain visible weight, a structural quality to his stillness that made him seem simultaneously younger and much older than he was. His jaw was set. His dark hair, the Dunsmore hair, that particular shade of near black that the portraits in the East Gallery had worn for 3 generations, was slightly dishevelled, as though he had dragged a hand through it more than once before the rest of the house had woken. It was the kind of dishevelment that is not carelessness but evidence of a mind that has been running since the small hours and has recruited the body into its agitation without fully meaning to. His eyes, grey as the sky outside, moved at last from the frost-tipped lawn to the letter that lay open on his writing desk. He had read it 4 times. He did not need to read it a 5th. He already knew every word of it by heart, and every word was a quiet catastrophe dressed in the measured language of professional concern, which was, as he had understood from the first reading, the most dangerous kind. "The matter of Miss Valewood's position at Harcastle Hall has come to our attention," the letter began, "in the precise bloodless hand of Mr. Gerald Fosway, the family's solicitor since before Tiberius had been born. It has been suggested, with some conviction I am sorry to say, that the lady has formed an attachment inconsistent with the professional discretion expected of a governess in a household of your standing. The source of this suggestion is, as you will appreciate, impossible to dismiss without consequence." The source. Tiberius set his cup down on the windowsill without looking at it, and it rocked slightly before settling, a small circular sound in the silence of the study. The source was his aunt, Lady Constance Pembridge, whose talent for destruction was matched only by her talent for making destruction look like concern. She had been watching Meliora Valewood since the woman arrived at Harcastle Hall 14 months ago, watching with the particular focused attention of someone who has already decided what they intend to find and is simply waiting for evidence to arrange itself into a shape that will serve. He turned away from the window. The study was a room that suited him, not comfortable exactly, but honest. Books lined 3 walls from floor to ceiling, most of them red, many of them annotated in his cramped and angular hand. A fire had been laid but not yet lit, the cold morning insisting on its own presence for the time being. A pair of riding boots stood by the door, still muddy from yesterday's ride across the South Fields, a ride he had taken specifically to avoid thinking about what he was now thinking about regardless, which was the particular futility of avoidance as a strategy when the thing being avoided is internal. The large oak desk at the centre of the room was covered in papers, estate accounts, a letter to his land steward, correspondence from London that had been waiting 2 days for his attention. But the Fosway letter sat apart from all of it, its single sheet of cream paper managing to look somehow larger than its physical dimensions suggested. He sat down. He picked up a pen. He wrote nothing. Meliora Valewood. He turned the name over in his mind, the way you turn a stone over in your hand. Not quite sure what you expect to find underneath it, but unable to stop yourself from looking. He had hired her himself, which had been unusual, and he had been aware of the unusualness at the time. He remembered the quiet, precise raising of Mrs. Alderton's eyebrows when he had returned from London with a governess already chosen, her references reviewed, her start date agreed upon, the whole matter handled without the involvement of the aunt who had been managing such appointments for years. That aunt was Lady Constance Pembridge, and he had not wanted Lady Constance's hand in this particular appointment. He had not, at the time, fully examined why. He had told himself it was efficiency. He had known in the part of himself he was least inclined to consult that it was something else. He had met Meliora at the lending library in Conduit Street. The memory came back to him not in pieces but whole, the way certain memories insist on presenting themselves fully or not at all. The smell of old paper and beeswax candles, the narrow aisle between tall shelves. A Tuesday afternoon in early August, when the heat outside had been the kind that sits on London like a physical weight, and the library had been cool and dim and almost entirely empty. She had been standing on the lower rung of a rolling ladder, her right hand braced against a shelf, her left reaching for a volume just beyond her reach. She had been wearing grey, a very plain grey dress that somehow managed to look entirely deliberate on her, as though she had decided that simplicity was a position rather than a default. Her dark brown hair had been pinned up in a style that suggested it had been arranged in a hurry, and had then proceeded to become something accidentally elegant, the kind of arrangement that exists at the precise intersection of intention and circumstance. He had noticed her immediately. He was not certain she had noticed him noticing her, but in retrospect, and he had had considerable retrospect on the subject, he suspected she had. The book she had been reaching for slid off the shelf before she could close her fingers around it. It fell. He had moved without quite deciding to, had covered the few feet of narrow aisle between his position and hers before the thought had fully formed, and he caught it before it hit the floor. When he handed it back to her, their eyes met. Hers were an unusual color, not quite green and not quite brown, something in between that shifted with the light, and in the warm gold dimness of that library, they had been the precise color of autumn leaves in the last days before they turned completely. She had said thank you with a composure that struck him immediately, not the startled gratitude of a woman embarrassed by a graceless moment, but a calm that came from somewhere deeper than the surface, as though she had simply absorbed the small event and filed it without disorder. She had looked at him as though she had taken his measure in the time it had taken her to speak 2 words, and had arrived at a conclusion she was in no hurry to share. Later, when he had learned she was seeking a position as a governess, the decision had formed in his mind before he had properly examined it. His niece Charlotte, his brother Edmund's daughter, 9 years old now, and living at Harkastle Hall under his guardianship since Edmund's death 2 years prior, needed a governess of exactly that quality: composed, unsentimental, genuinely intelligent. Someone who would treat a grieving child like a person rather than a project, which was the distinction that most of the candidates he had previously considered had failed to suggest they understood. He had told himself that was all there was to it. He had believed it, with varying degrees of conviction, for approximately 3 weeks. After that, he had stopped believing it, and had begun instead the considerably more demanding exercise of behaving as though he still did. He picked up the pen again, and this time he wrote, "Miss Valewood, I require a meeting at your earliest convenience. The matter is urgent. I will come to Harkastle." He sealed it himself, gave it to his footman with instructions for it to reach Harkastle Hall before noon, and then stood at his desk with his hands flat against the wood, looking at nothing in particular, trying to understand what, precisely, he was feeling. He had been trying to understand that for 14 months. He had not significantly improved. Harkastle Hall sat 12 miles northeast of Dunsmore Park, at the end of a road that wound through beech forest before emerging suddenly into open farmland, the house appearing like a held breath released, long and low and Palladian in its bones, its stone face turned toward a south-facing garden that in summer was full of roses and in October was full of the dignified decline of things that had once been beautiful. The symmetry of the house was its argument. Every window balanced, every line considered. The kind of architecture that does not surprise but persuades, building its case slowly and with accumulating effect. Tiberius rode rather than taking the carriage. He needed the air or needed to move, or needed the specific occupation of managing a horse through 12 miles of autumn countryside so that his mind could work without the unhelpful supervision of his own self-consciousness. The road was good until the last 2 miles, where it narrowed between hedgerows and the cold came off the fields with a directness that the trees in the forest had been muffling. He arrived at 2:30. The sun was already lower than it should have been for that time of day, sitting at a pale and considered angle over the western tree line, the kind of afternoon light that is already thinking about evening while maintaining the polite fiction of being afternoon. The air smelled of wood smoke and something faintly sweet that he eventually identified as fallen apples from the old orchard near the east wall, their scent released by the cold into the stillness. Mrs. Alderton met him at the door with the composed efficiency she had maintained for 20 years in this house. Her expression told him nothing and everything simultaneously, which was her particular gift. Charlotte, she informed him, was in the schoolroom. Miss Valewood was in the garden. He found her at the far end of the south terrace, near the stone balustrade where a wisteria vine had twisted itself into the iron railings over so many decades that the two things had become effectively inseparable, the stone and the vine having arrived at a mutual arrangement that predated everyone currently living. She had a book in her hands, held closed rather than open, as though she had given up on reading and was simply holding it for the comfort of having something to hold. She was looking out over the garden, where the last of the asters stood in purple clusters against the brown-grey of the dying season, the flower heads bowing slightly in the cold air, with the patient resignation of things that understand their time is nearly over. She did not turn when he came through the terrace door, but she knew he was there. He was entirely certain of that. "You came yourself," she said. Her voice was low and even, the kind of voice that does not rise at the ends of sentences the way anxious voices do, the kind of voice that has learned to hold its shape under pressure. "I thought you might send Mr. Fosway." "Fosway has done quite enough," Tiberius said. She turned then. The October light caught her face at an angle that was not particularly flattering and somehow made her more beautiful for it, the slight shadows under her cheekbones emphasizing their architecture, the small tension at the corners of her mouth suggesting the effort of the composure rather than its absence. She was wearing dark blue today, and her hair was more deliberately arranged than it had been in the library. Someone had been careful with it, and the someone had been her. She had prepared for this conversation, he realized. She had sat with the knowledge of his coming and had arranged herself for it with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to everything. "Then you've read it," she said. 4 times. Something moved across her face that he had learned, over 14 months of careful and not entirely voluntary observation, to identify as the expression she wore when she was deciding how much of the truth to give. It was not dishonesty. He would have staked a considerable amount on the fact that Meliora Valewood was not a dishonest woman. It was something more like economy. She gave truth in portions calibrated to what she believed a situation could reasonably hold. "Lady Pembridge," she said. Not a question. "Yes?" "She has been watching me since September." Meliora set the book down on the balustrade without looking at it, a gesture so controlled it was almost formal. "I have been aware of it. I have been careful." "I know you have been careful," he said quietly. "That isn't the point." "Then what is the point, Lord Dunsmore?" The title landed between them with the faint, particular awkwardness he had come to recognize as deliberate on her part. She used it precisely, as a tool rather than as mere address, deploying it when she wanted to remind him of something rather than when she was simply speaking to him. They had operated for months in the strange, suspended etiquette of a relationship that was professional in its structure and something else entirely in its actual texture, and the title was her way of marking the boundary, of pointing at it so that neither of them could pretend not to see it. "The point," he said, "is that she intends to take it to the Earl of Whitmore." The colour did not leave her face, but something shifted behind her eyes, a recalibration rapid and invisible to anyone who had not been watching her face as carefully as he had. The Earl of Whitmore was the head of the county's social architecture, in the way that tidal forces are the head of the sea's movements, not always visible on the surface, but responsible for everything that moved in any significant direction. A word from him could determine, within the space of a single season, whether a family continued to thrive or found themselves quietly, irrevocably reduced in the estimation of everyone who mattered. "She'll tell him," Meliora said slowly, "that I have conducted myself improperly." "She'll tell him you have formed an attachment," Tiberius said, and the word arrived with slightly more edge than he had intended, the edge of a man who has been keeping something contained for too long. "To the guardian of the child in your care. She'll frame it as manipulation, an ambitious woman taking advantage of proximity to position herself." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. A crow called somewhere in the beech trees beyond the east wall, 3 sharp declarative notes, and then there was nothing but the wind moving through the spent asters and the distant creak of the old wisteria against the stone, that patient sound that the vine had been making for longer than anyone could account for. "Is that what she believes?" Meliora asked. Her voice was perfectly steady. Her eyes were not. "It is what she intends to say," Tiberius said carefully. "What she believes is, in my experience, an entirely separate matter." She looked at him for a moment longer, then was entirely comfortable, the particular look of someone taking a precise measurement. And then she looked away, out over the garden, and the line of her shoulders did something he had never seen them do in 14 months of observation. They did not fall. She was not a woman whose posture surrendered to difficulty. But something in them shifted, a subtle redistribution of weight that told him the composure was costing her more than it was showing, that underneath the careful stillness there was a person carrying something heavier than her expression was admitting. "You came here to tell me I must leave," she said. "I came here," Tiberius said, and stopped. He had composed the sentence on the ride over, had arranged the words with the care of a man who understands that certain words, once said, cannot be unsaid and must therefore be said correctly. Now they refused to come in the order he had arranged them. He tried again. "I came here to discuss the matter." "That is not what your letter said." "My letter said the matter was urgent." "Yes." A pause. "It said nothing about discussing." He looked at her. She looked at him. And in the 12 inches of October air that separated them on that cold stone terrace, in the space between his position and hers that had been exactly this size, maintained with exactly this care for 14 months, everything that had been accumulating sat like a third presence between them, patient and entirely unwilling to be dismissed simply because it was inconvenient. "No," he said at last, "I suppose it didn't." He had come here with a plan, clean, manageable, entirely sensible. A plan that Fosway had sketched and that Lady Constance would find acceptable. A polite and well-compensated departure. A letter of reference that would secure Meliora a position in another household, far enough away to satisfy everyone who required satisfying. It was a solution, it was reasonable. It would cost him nothing except the low, persistent ache that had been living in his chest since the moment he had hired a woman he could not stop thinking about and placed her in his house and allowed her to exist, daily, at the precise intersection of everything he was supposed to want and everything he was not supposed to feel. "Tell me something," he said. She waited. "The attachment Lady Constance intends to describe." He chose the next words with the care of a man crossing ice he cannot be certain will hold. "Is she wrong?" the crow called again from the beech trees. The wisteria creaked against the stone. The sun dropped another half-degree toward the horizon, and the light on Meliora's face shifted from the thin flatness of October afternoon to something briefly, inexplicably warmer, a quality of light that had no business being warm in late October and was warm regardless. She looked at him for a long moment that felt much longer than its actual duration, long enough for him to hear his own heartbeat, which was not something he was accustomed to noticing. "No," she said quietly. "She is not wrong." He stayed for dinner. That had not been the plan either, but Charlotte had appeared at the top of the main staircase at exactly the moment he had been standing in the entrance hall, debating with himself about whether to stay or to ride back before he made decisions he could not unmake. Charlotte had looked at him with the direct and unsentimental gaze she had inherited from her father, the gaze that assessed and reported without the softening filter that most people applied to difficult information, and said, "Uncle Tiberius, you look like you haven't eaten today." And that had been the end of the debate. Charlotte was 9 years old, and she was, in his private estimation, the most honest person in the county. She did not soften things. She had Edmund's eyes and her mother's stubborn mouth, and she had been carrying grief since she was 7, in the way that children carry things that are too heavy for them, quietly, without complaint, with an occasional visible effort that broke his heart in a way he never let show, because he had learned early that Charlotte did not want her pain witnessed as spectacle, only as fact. Meliora had been the first person since Edmund's death to make her laugh in the unguarded, unconsidered way children are supposed to laugh, the laugh that doesn't know it's happening, and he had noticed and had added it to the growing collection of things about Meliora Valewood that he was not supposed to be collecting. Dinner was laid in the small dining room rather than the formal one. It was just the 3 of them, and the small dining room was honest about what it was, a room for actual eating and actual conversation rather than the performance of those things, a room with slightly uneven floorboards and curtains that had faded pleasantly, and a fireplace that drew better than the formal dining rooms ever had. Charlotte talked about the bird's book Tiberius had sent from London in September, and she had facts about cormorants that she delivered with the authority of someone who has recently become the world's foremost expert on a subject, and is not yet certain the world is aware of this. Meliora listened and asked questions, and the questions were real questions, the kind that emerged from actual interest rather than the performance of it, and Charlotte's answers became longer and more elaborate as she registered that she was being listened to rather than managed. After Charlotte was sent to bed, and the house settled into the particular quiet of an October evening, fires banked, candles lit, the world outside reduced to wind and darkness, and the occasional call of a night bird somewhere in the old beeches, Tiberius and Meliora sat in the drawing room with the tea service between them and the situation between them, which was considerably more complicated than the tea service and considerably harder to set aside. "You know what it would mean," Tiberius said, "if she takes it to Whitmore." "I know exactly what it would mean." Meliora held her cup in both hands, a habit of hers he had noticed early, the particular comfort she drew from the warmth of it, the way it was both practical and somehow revealing, a small window into the person behind the composure. It would mean the end of any prospect of decent employment. It would mean, she paused, making the visible decision to be precise rather than diplomatic. It would mean I would become exactly what she wants to make of me. A story. A cautionary tale. Yes. And you, she said, without bitterness, simply accurately, would be the man who should have known better. That is the lesser damage. For you, she said. He set down his cup. He looked at the fire, which was doing the thing fires do in old country houses in October, burning with a committed authority, as though aware that it is the primary argument against the cold pressing in from outside, and takes that responsibility seriously. There is a way, he said slowly, to make what she intends to say irrelevant. The quality of the silence changed. It was a different silence from the earlier ones, warmer and more dangerous at once, the silence of a room in which something is about to be said that cannot be unsaid. Meliora did not move. She did not speak. But he saw the small change in her breathing, the almost imperceptible pause, the barely there hold, and understood that she was listening to him with her whole self now, not just her attention, but everything underneath it. If the attachment were formalized, he said. He could feel the words doing what the true words always do. They resisted, required effort, arrived with a weight that told him they had been waiting somewhere for a long time and were not accustomed to movement. If it were a matter of record rather than rumor, there would be nothing for Lady Constance to weaponize. Meliora set down her cup with a careful precision that was its own kind of answer. Not an answer to what he had said, but an answer to what she was feeling. The deliberateness of someone who has understood something large and is giving herself a moment before responding to it. "You are talking about marriage," she said. "I am talking about something," he said, that I have been failing to not think about for a year, and that I should almost certainly have addressed long before Lady Constance forced the matter into the open. She looked at him. In the firelight her eyes were dark and warm and entirely unreadable, which was unusual. He had spent 14 months learning to read them, and the unreadability told him she was feeling something she had not yet decided whether to name. "Lord Dunsmore," she said softly, and this time the title was neither tool nor reminder. It was the sound of a woman standing at the edge of something large, deciding whether to step toward it or back. "If you are proposing to me in order to manage a scandal, I am proposing to you," he said, "in spite of the scandal, not because of it." The fire spoke between them. The loose casement somewhere in the old house muttered in the wind. The October dark held everything still and cold outside, and inside the room was warm and the candles burned at their various stages of patient consumption, and Meliora Valewood looked at him for what felt like an entire season compressed into 30 seconds. "Give me until morning," she said at last. He nodded. He rose. He said good night with the care of a man who understands that a word, said at the right moment, carries more weight than a sentence, and that the right response to this particular moment is to give her the night she has asked for without ornamentation. He did not sleep. He lay in the spare bedroom listening to the old house settle, and the wind work its way around the east wing, and he stared at the canopy in the dark and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives in the small hours when there is nothing left to defend against, that the plan he had brought to Harcastle Hall that afternoon had died on the terrace, and that he was not sorry. The frost came back harder that night. By the time the first thread of light appeared above the eastern hills, the whole of the Harcastle grounds had been covered in a white that was almost indistinguishable from snow. Every blade of grass, every spent flower head, every stone of the old balustrade holding its own small architecture of ice crystals that caught the arriving dawn and scattered it in colors it had not planned on having. The old apple trees in the orchard had become sculptural things, their black branches sheathed in white, standing in the cold with a kind of patient dignity that had nothing to prove. The sky above them was doing its slow work of lightening, black to deep blue to the particular rose-pink of an October dawn that is genuinely cold and genuinely beautiful and does not intend to apologize for being both simultaneously. Tiberius had not slept. He had lain awake for 3 hours after going to bed, staring at the canopy, and then had dressed quietly in the dark, gone down to the stables, and spent time with his horse in the way he sometimes did when his mind refused to be still. Not riding, simply being in proximity to a large and uncomplicated creature that required nothing of him but presence. The stable lad had appeared at some point, blinking, and Tiberius had sent him back to bed with a gesture more automatic than unkind. He was on the south terrace when the sun actually came up. Standing where they had stood the previous afternoon, where he had stood dozens of times over 14 months of visiting Harcastle Hall, in seasons that had changed around him while he had been standing in approximately the same internal place, he watched the light arrive in its stages. First the sky paling, then the rose, then the gold, the specific October gold that is both warm and cold simultaneously, the light of a season at its most beautiful and most final. It flooded the terrace from the east, making every surface specific, every shadow sharp, every stone particular and defined. His breath made small clouds in the cold air. The wisteria caught the light along its bare branches and threw thin shadows across the stone in lines that shifted as the sun cleared the tree line and committed to its angle. He heard the terrace door behind him. He did not turn immediately. He heard her steps. She moved with a quiet that was not stealthy but honest, a footfall that said exactly what it was, and heard the small catch of breath the cold air drew from her, and then she was beside him, close enough that he was aware of her from the periphery of his vision, the dark blue of her dress against the white of the frost-covered garden. They stood for a moment looking out at the silver-white south garden, the asters gone pale under their coating of ice, the sky above deepening from pink to that fierce, uncompromising blue that follows October dawns when they are clear. "I have been thinking," she said. "I gathered." "About what you said." "Which part?" She turned to him. The morning light on her face was direct and unsparing, the kind of light that makes pretense impossible. and he could see in it everything she had decided and something of what deciding it had cost her. "The part where you said 'in spite of,'" she said. "I have been turning it over since you said goodnight, looking for the catch in it. Did you find one?" "I found several possible catches." A pause. "And then I realized that finding possible catches is something I have been doing for a very long time, since before I came here, since before Norwich even. It is a habit of survival that has served me well." She looked at him steadily. "But it is not the same thing as wisdom, and I have been confusing the two." He turned to face her fully. The sun was properly up now, low and fierce and horizontal, flooding the terrace in a light that made everything look newly made. Her eyes in that light were a clear, warm hazel, direct and open in a way that the careful, calibrated Meliora Valewood of drawing rooms and schoolrooms and professional arrangements did not generally allow herself to be. "Meliora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had been aware of not using it for 14 months. He was aware of using it now in the way that you are aware of a door opening in a room that has been closed for a long time. The change in pressure, the sudden availability of air, the faint sound of the hinges finally giving way. Her chin came up slightly, not in defense, in the attitude of someone choosing to receive something rather than deflect it. "There are things you don't know about me," she said. "I know that. My father was a solicitor in Norwich who died when I was 17. My mother remarried quickly. A decent man, kind enough with nothing whatever to do with any of this. I have no connections, no property, no family of consequence. I have a reasonable education, a willingness to work, and whatever Lady Constance Pembridge chooses to make of those facts." She said it without apology, but also without the performance of not apologizing, which was the distinction that made it something other than a speech. "Lady Constance Pembridge," he said, "is not a factor in this particular decision. She will make herself one. Let her." The words came out with a flatness that surprised him, the specific flatness of a decision that has been made past the point of argument. "I have spent a considerable portion of my adult life managing decisions around what will be acceptable to Lady Constance. It has not, on balance, produced outcomes I would recommend." Something moved in Meliora's expression, a very slight lightening. The brief contained humor she wore when something struck her as both amusing and incriminating. "You are describing a lifelong pattern," she said, "that you propose to abandon on the basis of 2 conversations and a cold terrace." 2 conversations, he said, and 14 months of everything in between. She was quiet for a long moment. The cold had put color high in her cheeks, a clear, clean color that made her look younger than her 26 years, and more alive than anyone had any particular right to look at that hour on a frost-covered morning in October. Behind her, the wisteria creaked against the balustrade in the cold, that same patient, familiar sound, as though it had appointed itself the ambient note of their particular story and intended to see it through. "You would be risking a great deal," she said. "Less than you think," he said. "More than most people would expect, and none of it," he added, meeting her eyes directly, "feels like risk from where I am standing." She was quiet for a moment. That was very specifically hers, the moment she gave herself when she was making a decision she intended to make completely without remainder. "Yes," she said, "just that. No qualification, no calibrated portion of truth held in reserve. Just the word clean and whole, placed in the morning air between them like a stone set in an open palm." He exhaled. He had not been tracking how long he had been holding his breath. "Yes," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Yes," she said again, and this time the composure broke, not in tears or gesture, but in a smile that arrived slowly and was entirely genuine and slightly astonished at itself, the smile of someone discovering they are braver than they had previously understood. For a moment she looked exactly the way she looked when Charlotte made her laugh, unguarded, unperformed, wholly present in her own face. He did not kiss her. The moment held its own dignity, and he had the instinct to honor that rather than collapse it. He reached out instead and took her hand from where it had been holding the wool shawl against the cold, and held it in both of his, and the warmth of that, the simple, declarative warmth of two people who have made a decision and are holding it between them, was sufficient. He told Fosway that same afternoon. He had ridden back to Dunsmore Park at mid-morning, arriving to find Fosway already in the hall. The old solicitor had apparently anticipated an early return and had presented himself at the door ahead of the houseman's announcement, which was Fosway's way of communicating urgency without descending to the undignified territory of actually expressing it. They sat in the study, with the fire finally lit, and the clear October light doing its angular work across the floorboards. Fosway had a leather folder in his lap. Tiberius did not allow him to open it. "I intend to marry Miss Valewood," he said, before Fosway had arranged himself fully in his chair. "The matter is decided." Fosway's face did very little. This was one of his most useful qualities. He inclined his head. "My lord," he said, Lady Pembridge will do whatever she does," Tiberius said. "I have decided that this will not determine the outcome." A pause. Fosway set the leather folder on the desk with the careful precision of a man revising his morning. "If she moves to Whitmore before the engagement is known, then we ensure it is known before she has the opportunity. That would require considerable speed, my lord." "I am aware." Fosway looked at him for a moment, with the expression he wore when he was performing the simultaneous calculations of professional assessment and personal concern, which in his face were almost indistinguishable from each other. "Miss Valewood," he said, choosing his words with evident care, "is a woman of good character. I want to be precise about that. My concern is not her character." "I know. What is your concern, Fosway?" The solicitor looked at the fire. "That a crisis is being permitted to accelerate a decision that might otherwise have benefited from more deliberate time." "More time," Tiberius said, with something close to a laugh in it, "is what the last 14 months have been. I have had more time. I have used it to become entirely certain. What I failed to do, which I regret, was act on that certainty before someone else made it urgent." Fosway picked up the folder again and opened it. "Then," he said, with the measured cadence of a man adjusting course with professional dignity intact, "we should discuss the announcement." They worked for 3 hours. Fosway drafted. Tiberius reviewed. Together, they composed 39 letters addressed to every household in the county that required informing before Lady Constance could inform them differently. The letters went out by midday Tuesday, dispatched simultaneously so that no household might learn before another, and use the advantage to position themselves. It was, Tiberius thought, watching the footman depart with the final batch, the most elegant piece of strategy he had ever participated in. The announcement did not defend, did not explain. It simply established at speed a fact that made Lady Constance's intended move irrelevant before she could make it. Lady Constance heard about it on the Thursday. She was in her drawing room on Grosvenor Street when her companion Miss Trevelyan brought her the information, and she sat with it for a long and very specific silence that Miss Trevelyan, 11 years of service, had built a finely calibrated instrument for reading those silences, addressed by becoming deeply interested in her embroidery. "He's done it deliberately," Lady Constance said at last. "Yes, my lady," Miss Trevelyan said without looking up. "He's done it specifically to prevent me from acting first." "Yes, my lady." Lady Constance pressed her lips together and looked at the window, where London conducted its Monday business with complete indifference to her feelings on the matter. She thought about Tiberius, about the boy she had known since he was 7, who had always been more stubborn than clever and more principled than convenient. And she thought about the solicitor's daughter from Norwich, and about what it meant that a man who could have had any alliance in the county had looked at that woman and decided she was worth the loss of everything else. She picked up her teacup. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "We shall see," she said to no one and to the general situation, and she set the cup down and moved on to the next thing, as women of her particular type have always moved on, with the composure of someone who considers a defeat a postponement and is already thinking about the ground ahead. The weeks between the announcement and the wedding held a texture that surprised Tiberius. He had expected logistics. He had not expected to find himself learning a person, not through the managed exchange of biography and considered opinion that social acquaintance permits, But in the specific, irreversible way, you learn someone when the professional frame that has been holding you both at a careful distance is quietly removed, and you are simply, suddenly, in the presence of who they actually are. He was at Harcastle Hall more than Dunsmore Park. His land steward, Mr. Colwick, managed this, with the equanimity of a man who has served the estate long enough to consider an engaged lord a manageable variable. Charlotte adapted immediately, with the efficient practicality of someone who had already decided how she felt about the outcome, and saw no reason to engage in further deliberation. He learned that Meliora rose before anyone else in the household, and spent the first hour of her morning in the small library off the east corridor, not reading efficiently but wandering, following footnotes into other books, abandoning chapters midway when something better presented itself, returning to things she had set down days earlier. He learned that she had a specific and non-negotiable position on morning conversation, which was that it required tea to precede it. He learned that her silences, which he had been misreading slightly for 14 months, were not reserve but attentiveness. She was not withholding herself from conversation, but genuinely listening to it first, which was a distinction he came to value as much as anything he had learned about her. He discovered by accident that Charlotte had told Meliora things about Edmund that Charlotte had not told him. He found this out on a November afternoon, when he arrived at Harcastle Hall unannounced, and went upstairs to find them, following the sound of voices to the schoolroom door, which was standing half open. Charlotte was on the window seat, the Birds book face down beside her, talking about her father's laugh, a specific memory of it, the way it started low and built, and Meliora was listening with the whole-body attention she brought to things that mattered, the attention that is not just ears but presence, and the quality of the silence between Charlotte's sentences was so tender it was almost unbearable to witness from outside. He stepped back from the door without announcing himself. He stood in the corridor with one hand against the wall and felt something in his chest that was too large to be comfortable and too necessary to be set aside. And he understood, with the specific and unhurried clarity that sometimes arrives not in a moment of drama, but in a quiet corridor outside a half-open door, that he had made the right decision. Not the strategic decision or the managed risk decision. The right one, in the simple, durable sense of that word, which is the only sense that ultimately matters. The wedding was set for the 3rd week of December. It was not a grand affair. Tiberius had made this decision deliberately and without apology. He had chosen the village church at Dunsmore Vale, 60 people at a comfortable press, 80 at a generous one, and a guest list limited to those whose presence was genuine rather than obligatory. Fosway had raised one eyebrow at the scale. Tiberius had said, "The larger it is, the more it looks like a statement. I don't want a statement. I want a wedding." Fosway had lowered the eyebrow and adjusted his notes. There were, in the weeks that followed, 3 households that quietly withdrew their customary winter invitations. The absences were noticed by everyone and acknowledged by no one, which was the specific grammar of social exclusion in that county. Loudly silent, eloquently empty. Tiberius had anticipated this and had said so to Meliora on an evening when the first absence had confirmed itself. 3, she said. She held her shawl gathered around her, not for warmth, but for the gathered comfort of her own arms, a habit he had noticed twice before, and recognized as the gesture she made when something was landing harder than she was showing. "Is that better or worse than you expected?" "Better," he said honestly. She looked at him with the slight sideways quality her gaze sometimes took on when she was checking whether something was true or merely kind. "You're not saying that to manage me. I am almost never kind when it costs me accuracy," he said. "You know that." A pause. The small, contained smile arrived at the corner of her mouth. "I know that," she agreed. He looked at her in the November firelight and thought about the 39 letters and the 3 absent invitations and the one woman in London arranging her position like furniture after a flood, and he thought that none of it was the part that mattered. The part that mattered was here, in this room, in this light, in the specific fact of this woman who had been asked to absorb a year's worth of uncertainty and observation and professional constraint and had come through all of it with herself entirely intact. He found that remarkable. He found that increasingly he found most things about her remarkable, which was either a problem or a grace, depending on how you approached it. He had decided some time ago to approach it as a grace. The morning after the wedding, Dunsmore Park woke slowly. The way houses wake when they have been asked to hold something large and are still, in their old bones, processing the weight of it. The fires had burned low overnight, and the housemaid moved through the rooms in the grey December silence, building them back up with the quiet efficiency of someone who understands that warmth in an old house in winter is not a comfort, but a commitment, an argument made daily against the cold that would otherwise win by default. Tiberius had been awake since before the light changed, not from restlessness, from something closer to its opposite, a stillness so complete that sleep had simply become irrelevant. He lay in the darkness and listened to the house breathe around him, the creak of old timbers settling in the cold, the distant murmur of wind finding the east wing's perpetual weakness, and beside him, the steady, quiet presence of the woman he had married the previous day, her breathing low and even, one hand open against the pillow in the unguarded position of someone who has, at last, decided it is safe to rest completely. He did not move for a long time. His mind, which had spent the previous 3 months in a state of continuous strategic calculation, the letters, the timing, the announcement, the management of every variable that Lady Constance had put into motion, had gone entirely quiet. There was nothing left to plan, nothing to outmaneuver or arrange at careful distance. The thing had been done and it was right, and the December morning outside the windows was completing its slow concession from black to pale silver, and that was entirely sufficient. Meliora stirred. She had a particular way of waking he was discovering for the first time, the reverse of how she moved through the world, unhurried, soft at the edges, the composed surface arriving in stages rather than all at once. For perhaps 30 seconds between sleep and full waking, she was simply herself without architecture. He found those 30 seconds unexpectedly precious. She opened her eyes, looked at the ceiling first, confirming its existence, then turned to him. "You've been awake for hours," she said. "A while." "Thinking?" Strangely, no. She looked at him with eyes that the winter morning light made a clear, settled hazel. Not the shifting amber of firelight, not the uncertain color of October terraces, but something specific and decided. The color things become when they have stopped trying to be anything other than what they are. "Good," she said simply, and closed her eyes for 4 more minutes before she was fully, practically awake. And the first morning of their life together began. Charlotte arrived 2 days after Christmas in a carriage that also contained 2 hatboxes, a trunk, 3 volumes of natural history, and a firm set of opinions about the arrangement of her new bedroom. She walked through the front door of Dunsmore Park with the authority of someone completing a journey they had always intended to make, assessed the entrance hall with the measuring gaze of a 9-year-old who takes spatial arrangements seriously, and announced that the portrait of the 3rd Viscount Dunsmore in the East Corridor would be significantly better placed in the library, where fewer people would be required to encounter it involuntarily. Meliora agreed immediately. Tiberius noted, with something between amusement and genuine admiration, that she had thought the same thing for 14 months without saying so. The portrait was moved by the end of the week. Charlotte settled into the house with a bravery that was characteristic, her father's bravery, the kind that does not wait to feel ready. But in the evenings, when the day was long behind her, and the firelight had taken on its particular still quality, he would sometimes catch in her face a look that was very young and very far away. It was the look of someone visiting a room in their own heart that still hurt to enter. He had never known how to reach her there. Edmund had known. Edmund had always known how to sit with Charlotte in her difficult places without trying to fix them. But Edmund was 2 years gone, and the gap between who Tiberius was and who his niece sometimes needed had been one of the quiet griefs of the previous 2 years, the kind he carried without adequate resolution, because some inadequacies cannot be resolved, only acknowledged and lived alongside. On a Thursday evening in early January, Charlotte did not come down for supper. Meliora went upstairs to find her. The Bird's book was closed on the window seat, which was unusual in itself. Charlotte read that book the way other people breathe, as a continuous and largely automatic activity. And Charlotte was sitting on the library floor beside the lowest shelf, holding a thin brown volume with no title on its spine, old and worn at the corners, with the specific wear of a book that has been handled with affection over many years. Her face was very still in the way faces go still when they have been crying for some time and have stopped, but the passage of it is not yet complete. Meliora stood in the doorway for a moment, then she crossed the room and sat down on the floor beside Charlotte, in her good dress, without comment or ceremony. Not in a chair, not in any position that would place her above or apart, simply on the floor, present and level, the way you have to be when the thing that needs company is sitting on the ground. She did not speak first. She simply sat, which was, Tiberius understood later when Charlotte described it to him in her direct and specific way, exactly the right thing, not the comfortable thing, not the instinctive thing for an adult managing a child's grief, but the right one. The choice of someone who understands that silence that has been sitting alone for a long time does not need to be solved or guided or redirected towards something more manageable. It needs to be joined. Charlotte held the book out to her. "It was my father's," she said. "He left it here the summer before he died. He forgot it. He was always forgetting books." A pause with several years inside it. "He said he would collect it next time." Meliora opened the book. Inside the front cover, in a man's loose, generous handwriting, E. Dunsmore, July 1827, lent to no one, by strict order of the owner. Charlotte made a sound that was almost a laugh. He wrote that in all of them, so people would give them back. Another pause. They didn't always. "No," Meliora said softly. "People rarely do." Charlotte leaned her head, very slightly, against Meliora's shoulder, and Meliora remained exactly where she was, steady, unhurried, entirely present, while the library fire threw its long gold light across the two of them, the woman and the girl and the forgotten book, and the January evening pressed its dark and patient face against the windows. Tiberius had come to the doorway and stopped. He had seen all of it. He stood in the corridor for a long time, with one hand against the doorframe, not entering, not speaking, understanding that some moments are complete without a witness, and the only respectful thing is to recognize them as such. He went back to the sitting room and waited. When they came down 20 minutes later, Charlotte's face had the clean, stripped quality of someone who has passed through something difficult and come out the other side. Not cheerful, not performed, but genuinely present in a way that had not been available to her an hour before. She sat at the supper table and asked with full seriousness whether cormorants were capable of grief, and the conversation that followed lasted through 3 courses and produced no scientific consensus but considerable warmth, and Mrs. Alderton in the doorway wore the expression of a woman who has waited a long time for a house to become what it was always meant to be. After Charlotte was in bed, Tiberius sat with Meliora in the sitting room. The fire was high. Outside, snow was falling, the quiet, patient kind that covers the world without announcement. "What did you say to her?" he asked. Meliora was quiet for a moment, holding her tea in both hands as she always did, drawing warmth from it. "I told her that her father left the book there on purpose." He looked at her. "You don't know that." "No," she said. But she needed to believe that someone who loved her had chosen to leave something of himself in the place where she was going to live. "And it is not impossible," she looked at the fire. "People who love their children do things like that quietly, without ceremony." He thought about Edmund, about the specific unannounced ways Edmund had loved the people in his life, the books left in odd places, the notes tucked inside letters, the small kindnesses that were only fully visible in retrospect, and he thought that Meliora, who had never met Edmund, had understood something essential about him from a child's grief and a forgotten book and 30 minutes on a library floor. "She'll be all right," Meliora said, not as reassurance, as assessment. "Yes," he said, "I think she will." It was on the 5th day of January that the carriage arrived. Tiberius was in the North Fields with Colwick, his land steward, inspecting a section of fence that had been making structural arguments since October. The morning was bright and hard, the snow from the previous week still holding in the shaded ground, the sky a fierce and cloudless blue that gave no warmth whatsoever. Colwick was mid-sentence on the subject of the tenant's goats, which had apparently entered a new and unprecedented phase of strategic escalation, when a rider came across the field from the direction of the house. Tiberius read the note in the saddle. "A carriage has arrived, my lord, Lady Pembridge. She has come without invitation or prior notice. Mrs. Alderton has shown her to the drawing-room. Mrs. Dunsmore is with her." H. Alderton. He looked at the note for 3 seconds. Then he folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and turned his horse toward home at a pace that Colwick, watching him go, would later describe to his wife as the particular kind of fast that means something serious. He rode hard. The snow-patched fields went past him in a blur of white and brown, and the hard blue sky overhead, and his mind, which had been quiet for 2 weeks, woke up fully and immediately. Not with panic, exactly, but with the specific alertness of a man who understands that the person he most needs to protect is in a room with the one person who has spent the better part of the previous year trying to diminish her, and that she has no way of knowing he is coming. He arrived in 18 minutes. He dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, handed the reins to the stable lad without looking, went up the front steps at the kind of pace that causes footmen to step aside without being asked, crossed the entrance hall, and reached for the drawing-room door. And then he stopped. Through the door, old oak, solid but not soundproof to someone standing close, he could hear voices, 2 of them, even and measured, both of them, without elevation or the tight edge of someone working hard to hold their composure under pressure. He stood with his hand on the handle, and he listened, against every instinct, because something in the quality of what he heard made him wait. Lady Constance's voice first, precise, cordial, carrying underneath its cordiality the specific pressure of a woman deploying the full weight of her social authority against a surface she fully expects to give way. "I hope you will find the management of a house of this scale, of this history, less daunting than it might initially appear. Of course, there are things one simply absorbs over time, things one learns by being born into a particular world." A brief silence, then Meliora's voice, and this was the thing that stopped him where he stood and made him slowly, deliberately take his hand off the door handle. Her voice was not elevated, it was not defensive. It did not carry the barely perceptible tightness of someone working to stay composed under pressure. It was simply, entirely, completely calm. The calm of a woman who is standing in her own house, in full knowledge of what she is, with nothing left to prove to anyone in the room. "Yes," Meliora said, "I expect you're right. There is a great deal one learns by being present in a place, rather than simply by being born near it. I find I am learning something new about Dunsmore Park every day. It is one of the things I enjoy most about living here." Another silence, longer, a different quality to it. "You are very composed," Lady Constance said, and something had shifted in the words. A barely perceptible repositioning, like a woman who has pressed her full weight against a wall expecting it to move, and discovered with some surprise that it is load-bearing. "I have had good reason to be," Meliora said pleasantly, "though I find here that I have less need of it than I once did. Which is a relief. Composure is useful, but it is exhausting to maintain at such close quarters." The silence that followed was the kind Tiberius recognized. He had experienced it himself on an October terrace, when he had handed Meliora a truth she hadn't expected, and she had taken it without flinching. It was the silence of someone recalibrating, of someone who had arrived entirely prepared for a particular kind of resistance and had found, instead, a kind of ground they had no map for. He stepped back from the door. He walked quietly to the small sitting room across the hall, sat down in the chair nearest the fire, and waited. 11 minutes later, he heard the drawing-room door open. He heard Lady Constance's measured footsteps cross the entrance hall. He heard the front door. He heard the carriage. He sat until the sound of wheels on gravel had faded completely into the cold January air, and then a little longer, because some sounds deserve to be heard all the way to their end. Meliora appeared in the sitting-room doorway. She looked at him. He looked at her. Her color was slightly higher than usual, the only visible evidence that anything of consequence had occurred. But her expression was the one he had come to love most of all her expressions, the quiet, undramatic one that meant she had passed through something, taken its precise measure, and found herself entirely intact on the other side. "You were in the hall," she said. "I was." "How long?" "Long enough." She crossed the room and sat down across from him, folded her hands in her lap, with the neat precision of someone completing a task that is now done, and looked at him with those clear and steady eyes. "She came to see whether I would be frightened," Meliora said. "Yes." "I wasn't." "I know," he said. "I heard." Something moved across her face then. Not the small, contained smile, not the quick, warm laugh, but something quieter and deeper than either of those. A private satisfaction that existed entirely for its own sake and was not performing itself for anyone in the room. It was the expression of a woman who has stood in a place she was told she had no right to occupy and has found it solid under her feet and has registered that fact without requiring an audience. "She won't come again," Tiberius said. "No," Meliora agreed, "I don't think she will." He looked at her across the small, bright room, the January light hard and clear through the windows, and thought, not for the first time, but with the accumulating force of someone who has been arriving at the same conclusion from different directions for over a year, that he had married a woman of considerably greater resource than even he, who had been paying close attention, had fully understood. Lady Constance had come to test the foundations. She had found them, to her evident surprise, sound. He reached across and took her hand. She turned her palm against his. The familiar warmth of it, the specific warmth of a choice that had been made completely and without remainder, and that did not require revisiting. "The goat situation," he said after a moment, "has apparently escalated." She closed her eyes briefly. "Of course it has. Colwick has strong feelings on the matter. Colwick always has strong feelings. He was in the middle of expressing them when your note arrived." She opened her eyes and looked at him, and the smile arrived, all of them at once, the quiet one and the warm one and the genuine one. And she said, "I'm sorry for the interruption." "I'm not," he said. February arrived with the particular quality of English winter that is not dramatic, but persistent, a grey, patient cold that settled over the Wiltshire hills and declined to be hurried. The days were short. The light came in at a low and considered angle through the tall windows of Dunsmore Park, laying long, warm bands across the floors that moved as the hours turned, marking time the way the sun has always marked it in old houses that have been watching long enough to stop being surprised. Fossway came in the second week of February on an estate matter, a tenant arrangement in the northern parcels requiring signatures. He arrived mid-morning, conducted his business with the efficient precision of 30 years' service, and was halfway to his coat when Meliora appeared in the study doorway and asked him to stay for luncheon with a quiet directness that left very little room for polite refusal. He stayed. They sat at the lunch table, the three of them and Charlotte, who had placed her bird's book face down beside her plate, in the specific way that meant she intended to return to it the moment courtesy permitted, but was making a good faith effort in the meantime. Fossway was, for the first time in Tiberius's living memory, something other than professionally contained. He ate his soup. He listened to Charlotte's considered argument for the cormorant as a significantly underappreciated species. And then he offered, with a diffidence that was almost endearing, that he had once seen a cormorant on the Thames near the Inns of Court, standing on a post with its wings spread in the cold, and had thought it looked remarkably like a judge. Charlotte stared at him with undisguised delight. "Did you draw it?" she asked. "I'm afraid I cannot draw," Fossway said. "I will draw it for you," Charlotte said, with the generous authority of someone offering a gift they are entirely confident will be appreciated, if you describe it precisely. He described it. She drew it on the back of a piece of Dunsmore Park stationery with the speed and accuracy of someone to whom observation and rendering are the same act. She gave it to him without ceremony. He folded it with great care and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat close to his chest and said nothing further about it. At the front door, leaving, Fossway pressed Tiberius's hand. He looked briefly past him, down the entrance hall, to where Meliora was visible in conversation with Mrs. Alderton, practical, unhurried, entirely at home in the space she occupied. "Your father," Fosway said in the particular tone of a man who does not often speak personally and is choosing his words accordingly, "made a great many decisions in this house. Some of them were wise." He looked at Tiberius directly. "This one is wiser." He put on his hat. He went down the steps to his carriage without looking back, which was characteristic of him, and the carriage moved down the gravel drive between the bare winter beeches and turned out through the gate, and Tiberius stood in the open doorway until it was gone. Spring arrived the way it always arrives in Wiltshire, not all at once, not with announcement, but with a series of small and specific surrenders. The snowdrops first, appearing along the east wall with the improbable confidence of things that know something the rest of the world has not yet been told. Then the bare branches beginning their internal reckoning with warmth, a barely perceptible change in the quality of the wood, a readiness that had not been there in January. Then the crocuses in the south garden, purple and white and yellow, holding their colour in the uncertain March light with the stubborn brightness of things that have been waiting underground a long time, and have no intention of being subtle now that they have finally arrived. Meliora noticed all of it, not generally but specifically. The morning she came in from the garden and told him the wisteria on the south terrace had put out its first green tendril, a single thin shoot reaching for the iron balustrade. The afternoon she found Charlotte crouched in the east border, studying the soil near the old apple trees with focused intensity, and came to find Tiberius specifically to tell him that his niece had discovered, entirely on her own, that the earth near those trees smelled different from everywhere else, and had correctly hypothesized that the roots had changed the soil composition over many years. He had not known that. He had lived in or near this house for 34 years and had not known it. The new governess arrived in March, Miss Harcourt from Devonshire, capable, thoughtful, with the composed intelligence of someone who had been given some indication of what the interview would involve and had decided to take the position regardless. Charlotte had conducted the interview herself, with Meliora present at Charlotte's specific request. It had lasted 2 hours and had covered, among other things, the candidate's views on the portrait now in the library and whether she believed cormorants were as remarkable as the available evidence suggested. Miss Harcourt had answered both questions with precision and evident sincerity. Charlotte pronounced her acceptable with potential. Meliora reported privately to Tiberius that she was excellent and that Charlotte knew it perfectly well and was simply managing the dynamic. She said it with the tone of someone who has observed a behavior and recognized its source. "From whom?" Tiberius asked. "Do you suppose she learned that particular approach?" Meliora looked at him with the expression she wore when something was both amusing and slightly incriminating. "I have absolutely no idea," she said. In late March, a note arrived from the wife of Sir Aldous Tremaine, the one household that had remained silent since October. It was brief, written in a hand that was not quite consistent with Sir Aldous's previous correspondence, and it conveyed, with somewhat formal warmth, that Lady Tremaine had been unwell through the winter, but wished to offer her congratulations and hoped they might call when the weather improved. Meliora showed it to Tiberius over breakfast. He read it. "Not him," he said. "No," she agreed. "Her. I believe she wrote it herself and put his name to it." He looked at her. "Kiao noticed the handwriting." "I notice things," she said, in the tone of someone stating a plain fact that happens also to be a quiet declaration. He looked at her across the breakfast table, in the April morning light that came through the east windows warm and direct, and thought about October, about the frost-covered terrace and the man who had ridden 12 miles with a plan he had abandoned before the afternoon was over. He thought about the distance between who he had been on that Tuesday morning, reading Fosway's letter at the window, and who he was now, at this table, in this light, with this woman across from him, noting handwriting inconsistencies in letters from people who had underestimated her. "People are more complicated than their positions," Meliora said, looking at the note. "Yes." Lady Constance included. She looked up at him. Not immediately, but eventually. The corner of her mouth moved. "She was not entirely wrong that there were things I needed to learn. She was simply wrong about whether I was capable of learning them." He was quiet for a moment, You've thought about her. I've thought about what she was afraid of, Meliora said. Which is a different thing. She was afraid of change, I think, of a world that didn't arrange itself according to the rules she had spent her entire life learning to navigate. A pause. I understand that better than she would probably want me to. He looked at her. He thought about the Norwich Library and the rolling ladder and a book falling toward a floor it never reached, and about all the things that follow from a single unremarkable Tuesday afternoon in August, when two people happen to be in the same narrow aisle. He thought about 14 months of careful professional distance maintained at considerable mutual cost, and about the October morning that had finally made the cost visible and the maintaining of it no longer possible. I am very glad, he said, that I did not send Fossway. She looked at him. And there was the smile, all of its versions at once, the quiet one and the warm one and the one underneath them both, that had no precise name, but that he had been learning to read for over a year and intended to keep learning for the rest of his life. So am I, she said. On an April morning, with the sun sitting at a generous height above the eastern tree line, and the wisteria reaching in earnest along the south terrace balustrade, its buds just beginning to show their eventual purple, still weeks from opening but clearly committed to the project, Tiberius found Meliora where he had first found her, at the far end of the south terrace, looking out over the garden. He came through the terrace door. She heard him the way you hear the sounds of a life you have chosen, without effort, without looking. She turned, and the April light on her face was warm and direct and without shadow, and she was wearing the expression she wore when something was simply and completely itself and required no analysis. He stood beside her. Below them, the garden was doing its unhurried April work. The roses beginning their slow becoming, the early bulbs in their final days of bright assertion before the larger flowers took over, a blackbird conducting serious business near the base of the first rosebed. From inside the house came the murmur of Charlotte's voice and Miss Harcourt's response, the particular rhythm of a question being offered and a mind deciding what to do with it. I have been thinking, Meliora said. About what? About how this started. She looked at the garden. You came here with a plan to end something, and I was prepared for that. I had been preparing for it, in one form or another, for a long time, preparing for the moment when the thing that was too good to be sustainable would stop being sustainable. She paused. It is a very old habit, learning to expect the door to close. And now, he said. She turned to him. In the April light, her eyes were clear and warm and entirely open, the full unguarded attention she had been giving in careful portions for 14 months and had been giving freely for 3, the attention that cost her nothing anymore because it had become simply what she did, what she was in this house and with this person. Now, she said, I keep noticing that the door is open, and I keep being surprised by it, which I suppose will take some getting used to. He reached out and took her hand from where it rested on the stone of the balustrade. She turned her palm against his, fingers loosely interlocked, the warmth between them, the warmth of a choice made completely, and without remainder, made in October, and made again every morning since in the small unremarkable ways that choices renew themselves when they are the right ones. The wisteria reached along its iron rail. The blackbird finished its business and departed with purpose. Inside the house, Charlotte was building an argument about migration patterns that would require some time to fully dismantle. The April sun moved in its arc over Dunsmore Park, marking the hours the way it had marked them for 150 years, without urgency, without sentiment, but with the absolute and reliable presence of something that intends to keep showing up. Some stories begin with a letter. Some begin with a declaration made in exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person. This one began with a book falling from a library shelf on a Tuesday afternoon in August, and a man who moved before he had decided to, and a woman who said thank you with the composure of someone who already understood, without being told, that the world was about to offer her something worth receiving. She had been right. She had always been right. In the careful, patient, unhurried way she was right about things. He had simply been the last one to catch up. And on a bright April morning in Wiltshire, with the wisteria finding its season and the garden in full voice, and a 9-year-old inside the house conducting a rigorous scientific inquiry into the emotional capacity of cormorants, that particular distance had been closed, completely, irrevocably, and without the smallest remaining regret. And that, dear friends, is where we leave them. Not at the altar, not at the dramatic moment when everything hangs by a thread, but here, in the quiet, ordinary, extraordinary morning of a life that was chosen with courage and built, brick by brick, from everything that almost was lost. If Meliora's quiet strength moved you, if the moment Tiberia stood outside that drawing-room door and chose to listen instead of enter, said something to you about what love actually looks like when it is real, then you already know why we tell these stories. Because sometimes we need to be reminded that the most important decisions are not made in grand gestures. They are made on cold terraces, in the small hours, in the space between what is sensible and what is true. If this story found a place in your heart, please take a moment to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Leave us a comment. Tell us which scene stayed with you, which moment made you hold your breath. A like helps more people find stories like this one, and ringing the notification bell means we will meet again very soon. And if you would like to support this channel and help us keep these stories alive, the link is right there in the first pinned comment. Every gesture of support arrives here with real and genuine gratitude. Until next time, dear friends, we will be here, and we will always have another story waiting.